Good morning. Today starts a two-part series on Gebrokts, the minhag to refrain from eating Gebrokts. Now, before we dive in, what does the word Gebrokts actually mean? So, just the translation of the word. The word Brock is a German word, brocken, which actually means to break or to crumble. For example, in Yiddish, crumbs are called brekkelach, and the etymology of the English word to break comes from that same and the ancestral word that we're using here in the German, brocken. So the minhag is to refrain from breaking or from crumbing up the matzah. This was commonly practiced once upon a time in two ways. The first way, the most common way, which the Pasuk talk about in the context of Gebrokts, is bishul matzah, cooking matzah. It actually appears that once upon a time, the dish of Pesach was knaidlech. In other words, over the years, every Jewish holiday became shaped or flavored by the traditional food connected with that holiday. Many of them have survived till today. We have hamantashen on Purim, and we have latkes on Hanukkah, and cheese dishes on Shavuos, blintzes on Shavuos. Once upon a time, the food of Pesach was knaidlech, which is made by breaking up matzah into a flour and mixing it with water, making it into balls, and cooking it. That's knaidlech. Mm-hmm. Now, additionally, we're also going to talk about matzah that instead of just eating it dry as it is, you dip it into your soup to soften it up a little bit, and then you eat it like that. Let's take a step back a moment. What is matzah? What is the definition of matzah?
Unleavened bread.
Unleavened bread, right? So so there's no specific recipe to matzah. It just has to answer to the following criteria. First of all, it has to be made out of the 5 grains, which in Hebrew are called chita sa'ira, kusmin, shebel shul, and shifain, which are commonly translated as wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats. And those are the 5 grains which are subject to becoming chametz. That means that when you take those grains and they undergo a certain process, they become chametz. What does chametz actually mean? So, sorry? We translate it as leavened. Essentially, and it becomes kind of necessary to define exactly what chametz is in the context of many halachas, of what you are and not allowed to do with the grains and different processes with the grains. We're not going to get into it in detail now, but essentially what chametz means is that there's a certain stage, there's a certain step in the fermentation of the grain, which that makes it chametz. It's not fermenting per se, because there's many things that can ferment. You can make rice flour that will have a fermentation, and that doesn't make it chametz. Rice doesn't become chametz. It's specifically these 5 grains, probably something to do with the gluten, that a certain part of that process makes it become chametz. So matzah means to make a bread. So the first criteria that it has to answer to is to be one of those 5 grains. It has to also be bread. So in order for it to be bread, you're going to mix that with water or with liquid, right? And you're going to bake it. If you cook it, it's not matzah, right? If you take flour and you cook the flour, that doesn't become matzah. Bread. In order for it to be bread, it has to be baked. You're looking at me, Ruvain.
No, don't you bake matzah too?
Yeah, I'm just describing what matzah is. Matzah means you're taking something from the 5 grains, making a dough out of it, and baking.
Like a noodle. Right?
And baking, exactly.
Or a dumpling.
And you're baking it, and you're baking it in a way that it's fully baked before it reaches it becomes chametz, right? So nowadays we know 18 minutes. Doesn't necessarily, in practice we're makbid on the 18 minutes, but at least theoretically, it's not about the 18 minutes or a certain amount of minutes. It's about a certain step in the process that you have to make sure it's fully baked before that step in the process happens. Now, what does matzah actually look like? So people like to say, oh, once upon a time they had soft matzah that was more like the pita bread that we're used to. Until today, there are Yemenite communities who have that type of matzah. But nowadays it became more common, especially amongst Ashkenazim, to have the matzah that we're familiar with, which let's describe it as cracker matzah. Now the truth is, it's not so simple. It's true that once upon a time they had that and now we have this, but it's more complex than that. There were many different variations of making matzah that were prevalent over the years, both in terms of the thickness. Is it thin like a cracker? Is it thick like a pita bread? Or once upon a time it seems that it was even much, much thicker than that. The Gemara talks about not making it thicker than a tefach, which is a few inches, and it seems like once upon a time that's how they used to make it. They used to make matzah very thick, a couple of inches thick. So different stages in development of matzah have been studied. Also in terms of the texture of the matzah, which depends on the water to flour ratio. If you put more water, it's going to be softer. If you put more flour, it's going to be harder. And of course, in exactly how you shape it and how you bake it. And many essays have been written in trying to sort of look for clues in ancient works to figure out and to trace the exact hishtalshelus, the exact sort of chain of events over the different time periods and over different places, exactly how they used to make the matzah in different places. Now, that we're not going to get into that topic in this series of Gebrokts. We're going to touch upon it a little bit more in the second part than in today, but because it is relevant a little. But that's just an introduction, which is going to come up to know what matzah is. It's interesting to note that in general we say, of all the times of the year, Pesach is perhaps a time where we have a strong emphasis on minhag, on doing the tradition, the minhag, even at times when perhaps the minhag might seem to challenge certain halachas. So, for example, the cracker matzahs that we have today, really, there's a question as to whether or not you could even make hametzi on it. Is it really bread? What's the difference? Let's take a step back a second. What's the difference between the bread, the bagel that you're eating now, and a cracker? Or, right, they're made from flour and water base, and they're baked into, right, what makes it, or flour and liquid base, right? So you're familiar with the idea of pas haba b'kisnin. There's cake and crackers, which are mazonos, and then in some places you even have this notion or myth, whatever, called mazonos bread. Steve's just come back from New York, where it's a prevalent thing, right? So in order for a cracker can also be described as a bread. A piece of cake can also be described as bread. But in order for it to be a bread that you make hametzi on, it has to be the type of bread which is common to make a meal out to use for a meal. And that's the idea of pas haba b'kisnin, which is a bread which is not designed for a meal, and therefore you would make mazonos on it unless you were eating a certain amount. And there's different opinions as to what pas haba b'kisnin is. But one of the opinions, which is that crackers, like matzah, that we call matzah crackers, would be mazonos. And in fact, till today, Sephardim, when they eat the matzahs that we eat, they say mazonos on them, except on Pesach. On Pesach, they make hametzi on it. Year round, they say mazonos on it. But I'm just pointing out how here you have a custom which has been adopted by the entirety of Klal Yisrael, both for the not entirety, but the vast majority of Klal Yisrael, both Ashkenazim and Sephardim nowadays have the cracker matzah. And even though that presents a problem as to whether or not it's even hametzi, nevertheless, Klal Yisrael have adopted this, and saying that whatever virtues there are in baking the matzah specifically in this style trumps whatever challenges there are, halachic challenges, in baking it in this style. Additionally, you could argue that we all have this issue by the Seder, which we're cognizant of, that you want to eat the matzah within a certain time frame, and sometimes for some people it's difficult to digest the required amount of matzah, the requisite amount of matzah in that time frame. So one aspect of that, which we discussed last year, was that people often exaggerate what the size of matzah that you have to eat is. People think the size is a lot more than what it actually is. So that's one aspect of it. But another aspect of it is that it's hard. People who don't have teeth, for example, it's hard to eat cracker matzah, and it takes a long time to chew it. And you could imagine that for many people, if we would be eating soft matzah, something similar to what we know as pita bread, it would be a lot easier to eat it quickly. But nevertheless, this is the minhag, this is how we do it nowadays, and poskim are very hesitant to make any changes. For already hundreds of years we've been doing it this way, to have these cracker matzahs, and that's what we use, and we don't change that.
Even for the individual?
If there's yes, even for the individual, poskim are very hesitant about it. We'll see soon.
No, I'm saying for an individual person who has trouble.
Yeah, so we'll see soon that if for an individual person who can't chew it, so then there's the option of making it a little bit moist, which of course touches on the whole Gebrokts shaila.
We're not saying going by the.
No. Certainly, Ashkenazi poskim are very hesitant to allow that. Now, can I ask that questions that are not immediately relevant to understanding what we're talking about should wait to the end? If you need to clarify something that I'm saying, we could interrupt, but otherwise, let's keep the flow and yeah.
My experience is that today the Yemenites, they eat the...
Okay, so let's ask that personal experiences. Let's ask that personal experiences wait to the end, because it does interrupt the flow. I apologize. Now, the chumra of Gebrokts has had various iterations over the years and over the centuries. It does pop up here and there as something that individuals did keep or didn't keep. And of course, whenever it's discussed, one of the things you have to clarify is, well, what type of matzah was that person using, and how does the logic of Gebrokts or not Gebrokts apply to that matzah? So, for example, if you're talking at a time and place where people had very thick and very hard matzah, which was impossible to eat without soaking it in water, so then there's more of a reason to be lenient about it than perhaps in later times. So, for example, it's been pointed out that a lot of the anti-Gebrok camp often point to the Chacham Tzvi, I believe, or Rabbi Emden, in the name of his father, the Chacham Tzvi, that says about how this chumra is such a terrible chumra because it causes people to not be able to enjoy Yom Tov. Now, you have to understand that statement of the Chacham Tzvi is of limited relevance to us, because in his time, in his day and age, the matzahs that he was eating were almost impossible to eat if you wouldn't wet them. So, to use that as saying that nowadays we shouldn't do Gebrokts is not necessarily a convincing argument. Nowadays, the chumra of Gebrokts has become a chassidish minhag, meaning there are those who who are not Hasidim who have also adopted the minhag, but for the most part, it's attributed to the school of the Maggid of Mezrich. That means post Baal Shem Tov, the next generation of Hasidim, the school of the Maggid of Mezrich. They implemented and really made this minhag become the nachlas haklal, become sort of that something. It's a chumra that everyone should do. Everybody should refrain from Gebrokts. Until today, all Hasidim keep this minhag. We'll discuss in a moment a little variations between different Hasidim, how it's done, and different details about it. But the crux of the core of the minhag is something which all Hasidim, it's known as a Chassidish minhag. And again, there are some Gedolei Yisrael beyond the school of Hasidim who keep it, but more or less it's a Chassidish minhag. Now you have to understand that when this minhag started, and again it's attributed to the Maggid, the school of the Maggid Mezrich, it was quite a radical chumra. And one of the reasons why it was so radical is because you're telling people not to eat the food that is associated with Pesach, right? Imagine I tell you, no cheese blintzes on Shavuos, no hamantash on no knaidlech on Pesach. What do you mean, no knaidlech on Pesach? Knaidlech, Pesach, the Pesach food is knaidlech, right? And so much so that there's a tshuva written by Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac of Vitebsk, Rabbi Isaac of Vitebsk, who's one of the Talmidei HaMaggid. So he's from that first generation where this chumra is becoming widespread under the influence of the great Chassidic masters. And he writes like this: This was the way of our teachers in Mezrich, that they would refrain from eating any food made out of matzah meal, such as knaidlech. What would they do instead? You have to have knaidlech. You cannot. So they had another option. Now this option, don't try this at home. It would not pass. And nowadays this would be completely off the limits, but strictly speaking, halachically, this is permissible. We know there's another chumra on Pesach, which is much more binding and widespread than Gebrokts, and that is to refrain from eating kidneys, right? Lentils, beans, etc. Now, nowadays, we don't eat any product that has any kidneys in it. We completely refrain. In fact, there's even Last year, actually, we had a class, it wasn't recorded, it was on Yom Tif, but last year we did a class about whether or not you're allowed to use oil of kidneys. But once upon a time, it was common that people would take various kidneys and grind it into a flour, and use that flour to make Pesach dishes from. And the chumra of kidneys meant that in that case, they would have to treat that flour just as they treated wheat flour. So even though let's say buckwheat flour cannot become chametz, but they would make buckwheat flour and they would bake it in a process that they would do it quickly and make sure that if you were using the equivalent amount of recipe and time and process in wheat flour, it wouldn't become chametz. So then that's what people did. So says Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac of Etepsk, you know what we did in Mezrich? We would make knaidlech out of grika. Grika is buckwheat. They would make knaidlech and chremzel. I'm not sure exactly what chremzel is, but also such a type of dish. They didn't forgo on their knaidlech. They had knaidlech, but they couldn't make it out of matzah. They would make it out of buckwheat. Now, over the generations, the chumra of Gebrokts has become quite extreme in some places, and especially in Chabad. I would think it's fair to say that in Chabad, out of all Hasidim, we are the most extreme about Gebrokts. So if you've ever been to a Chabad house on Pesach, you've probably noticed that, for example, we're careful not to have any matzah or even crumbs of matzah on the table while we're eating any other food. So in most Chabad houses, certainly my experience, you make kiddush, you have matzah, and then you clear the table. Some people change the tablecloth, some people brush off all the crumbs, some people don't clear the table, but just when they're eating the matzah, they take a step back to make sure that no crumbs in the first place will fall onto the table, and that's it. Once you finish with the matzah goes away, and then you serve the soup, and the next course you serve the meal. In other communities who keep Gebrokts, it's not like that, and in fact, even in Chabad, it wasn't like that until, I would say, the generation of the Frierdiker Rebbe, and I'm going to explain why in a moment. The way it's done in other places is that you don't dip your matzah in the soup, but you could have the matzah on the table next to the soup, and most people will even make sure to keep the matzah covered, so they keep the matzah in those white matzah knaidlech, they're called, the white pouches for the matzah that you use for the seder. So you'll use that the whole Pesach. You'll never put your matzah directly on the table. You'll keep it in the pouch. But you could put a piece of matzah in your mouth and then take a bowl of soup, a spoonful of soup, and put it in your mouth and have it together. They're not makbid not to, many Chassidim are not makbid not to have the matzah in your mouth at the same time. In Chabad, it's like you don't even use the same dishes, and when we wash mayim achronim at the end of the meal, we don't wipe our fingers on our lips because in case there might be a crumb of matzah left over there. So we've really made it extreme. Also, there's another question of having matzah with other foods which don't contain water. So, for example, matzah and avocado, or matzah and scrambled eggs. And then you have food which is not really water, but maybe, let's say, if you have egg salad. Well, there's no water, but there is water because there's a little bit of water mixed in from when you boil the eggs. And even milk and wine, dipping your matzah in milk and wine. Wine often has water added to it. Milk often has water added to it. So are all of those things considered Gebrokts? And many communities are lenient, many are stringent. And in many families, many communities, what they do is they have a difference between adults and children, that they'll allow children to have matzah with, let's say, milk, for example, but only in separate dishes, which nowadays is easy because you just have Tupperware, so you don't need to keep separate dishes for the kids. But they will allow kids to have matzah with milk, let's say, but not the adults. And actually, it could even be that in Chabad also, until very recently, people allowed kids to have Gebrokts, at least on some level. I don't know exactly, not a complete Gebrokts, but sort of they were less strict with kids. But I think recently the Rabbi spoke about it in the late 80s, and I think it's kind of become standard in Chabad practice that even for young babies, absolutely no Gebrokts at all. Now, there is here a description from Rabbi Eliyahu Landau in the name of his father. So Rabbi Eliyahu Landau is a Chabad Rosh Yeshiva in Kfar Chabad. He lives in Bnei Brak. I learned with him. He was my teacher when I was in Kfar Chabad. His father was Rabbi Yankel Landau. Rabbi Yankel Landau was Marich Yomim. He passed away in his late 90s, and that was in somewhere around the year 1985, give or take. So he was the Rav, the chief rabbi of Bnei Brak, for a number of decades. But before he became the chief rabbi of Bnei Brak, he was the chief rabbi of Lubavitch. He was in Lubavitch under the Rebbe, when the Rebbe Rashab, that's the fifth Rebbe, was alive, he was the Rav HaChatzer. He was the Rav of the Lubavitcher Hoif. He was the Lubavitcher Rebbe's Rav. And the Rebbe Rashab was very close with him. And there's many anecdotes that we know about life in Lubavitch, specifically matters that pertain to halacha, from Rabbi Yankel Landau's testimony. Rabbi Yankel Landau was he took notes, he had a diary, and he was very meticulous in recording things accurately. There's numerous letters of the Rebbe to him asking him to verify details. So here's a description from Rabbi Eliyahu Landau, which is, obviously he himself doesn't know anything, but these are things that he heard from his father, who's telling him how it was in Lubavitch. So he writes that the Rebbe Rashab himself was extremely careful with Gebrokts, but the people around the table were less so careful. So he writes, for example, that only the Rebbe's matzahs were constantly covered. Other people had uncovered matzah on the table. They didn't dip it into their soup, but they weren't careful to keep it covered so that no crumb of matzah should mix with any speck of liquid. And he said the Rebbe Rashab himself wouldn't have matzah and soup in his mouth at the same time, but other people did. You put matzah and then you took a spoon of soup. But the Rebbe Rashab, he was extreme on this, and every time he took a spoon of soup, he would then wipe the spoon clean to make sure not a crumb of matzah would get mixed in over there. But later on, so you see already that even as recent as the time of the Rebbe Rashab, there was the Rebbe himself. In general, the Rebbe Rashab was known in all areas of life to be extremely machmir. Just another example that perhaps is connected to Pesach was that the Rebbe Rashab refused to have any fillings or implants of teeth, presumably at least in part because of the challenges that would present when it comes to Pesach, because if you have a foreign substance in your mouth, which may have absorbed chametz when you had a hot cholent, so right nowadays, and I'm not aware of many people who are machmir not to get fillings. Some people might be machmir to change all their fillings for Pesach. They're just kidding. You could have a survey. One day that's going to be a chumra, I think, there'll be some businessman here in Chicago who says, okay, we have a new business idea. Everybody come before Pesach. We'll make a special appointment and we'll blowtorch all your fillings. Okay. But, as I said, over the years... Yes?
How do you know if there's no, if he's so strict, how does he know that there's absolutely not even the tiniest crumb of matzah left in his mouth? When you have a soup.
I don't know exactly, but perhaps one thing you could do is you could rinse out your mouth, and it could be that some people do this, to rinse out the mouth with another liquid that's not water. Like if you have wine, and I think the good quality wines have no water mixed in, right? So then you could...
You said that most wines have water.
Some wines have water, yeah, okay. And there's only so much you could do, right? But Lamaisa, even though that was the case in the Rebbe Rashab's house, it seems that under the influence of the Frierdiker Rebbe and the Rebbe, this type of being machmir and Gebrokts, to the extent that the Rebbe Rashab was, did kind of within Chabad become the nachlas haklal, become the minhag, the practice that everybody keeps. And of course, with the exception of on the last day of Pesach, Havachan Shel Pesach, we don't have any Gebrokts at all, and we're quite extreme about it. There is actually, it's interesting because there's another discussion about whether or not you have to have separate dishes. In other words, for Achron Shal Pesach, where you cook knaidlech, can you cook the knaidlech in the same dishes that you use for the rest of Pesach? In practice, in Chabad, we do use the same dishes. I believe that's pretty much, in other words, you cook your knaidlech, and then the next year you use that pot on the first day of Pesach to cook your regular food, even though it absorbed knaidlech, right? We're not strict about that. It's said that the reason we're not strict about it is because there is this idea in halacha that after 12 months the taste expires. So we don't usually rely on that. Generally speaking, if you have a treifa, some utensil in your kitchen that became absorbed milk and meat, we don't tell you wait 12 months and then it's fine, you have to kasher it, but there is this idea of 12 months. Now the truth is it's less than 12 months because Achron Shal Pesach, and then you start Pesach cooking for Pesach a week before Pesach, so it's 12 months minus 2 weeks. But we're lenient nonetheless. There are some Chassidim non in Chabad who will only use the same dishes on the year before a leap year, because then you have a full 12 months before the next Pesach. I just want to point out that it's interesting that in the Alter Rebbe's tshuva about Gebrokts, which we're going to get to in part 2 of this series, the Alter Rebbe says, "Hamekel b'yom tevachon lehifsid," that if you're lenient on the last day of Pesach, then it's okay. And then later on, this seems to have become sort of, we make sure to eat Gebrokts in the last day of Pesach. Now, in the context that the Alter Rebbe is talking about, it would seem that what he's saying is that here I'm making you refrain from this, knaidlech is the Pesach food, and I'm making you refrain from it for the entirety of Pesach. So on the last day Yom Tov, we'll give you a little leniency because Achron Shal Pesach is the rabbinic edition. Biblically speaking, Pesach is only 7 days. So on the 8th day in the diaspora, we'll allow you to be lenient and indulge in your Pesach food. Whereas nowadays, where most of us don't consider knaidlech to be the Pesach food, it's almost become this ritual that we do, and the mystical explanation behind it, as explained by the Rebbe, that we sort of have a mystical reason why we have a ritual where we're going to dip the matzah and make all the matzah wet, and But in its an original context, the heter, the leniency to have gebrokts on the last day, was a nod to those people who were very much missing that knaidlech, which they had always grown up having knaidlech as the Pesach food, and suddenly you're telling everybody, hold off, we've got to stop doing this. Now,
So this
essentially,
was popularized in the times of the Rebbe Rashab?
no, it was popularized in the times of the Maggid. In the early days of Chassidus. I'm just saying that the way it's practiced in Chabad today, which is so extreme, where no crumbs on the table, etc., that is something which became popularized in the last, I would say, 2 generations or so. And it's interesting, I mentioned before that there are certain halachic challenges in the way we have matzah today, but our minhag to have the cracker matzah trumps those halachic challenges. I would say that with the Chabad way of doing Gebrokts, and it's not just Chabad, but it's also Chabad, there's another halachic challenge over here, and that is that essentially the whole way that our meals are structured in terms of making brachas is we only make a bracha on the bread, and we don't make a bracha on anything else that we eat during the meal. Why not? Because everything else that we eat during the meal is considered to be a parperes apas. Once upon a time, nowadays you could sit down and have a steak and french fries and go and fill yourself up on a huge meal without having any bread. Once upon a time that was unheard of. A meal meant that you had bread, and then whatever else you had, whether or not you actually had a piece of bread with the piece of meat or not. But the point was the meat was there as kind of, it was viewed as an additive or so, was a supplement to the bread, which is why Chazal instituted the laws of brachas, that when you have a meal, you say a bracha on the bread and everything else is covered by that umbrella bracha. I would argue there's certainly an argument to be made. There's certainly an argument to be made that if you are makpid, that means if you're insisting that we remove all bread from the table, all matzah from the table, before we eat the soup and the meat and the chicken and the potatoes, so then it becomes difficult to say, well, this meat and potatoes is just there to enhance the bread, and the bracha from the bread covers the chicken and potatoes. It's not an absolute argument, and I could hear counter arguments as well, but I'm just pointing to another halachic challenge, if you will, which has now been introduced by the strict adoption of this minhag of Gebrokts. Yes.
Can you remind me the halacha of consuming matzah during Pesach? Is it or is it not required that every day that you eat and consume?
It is not. So we also had a class on that a couple of years ago, which is available on the Spotify and on YouTube, whatever. But no, so halachically, there's no obligation. Well, you have to have a Yom Tov meal and a Shabbos meal, so technically you have to have matzah for there. But on Chol HaMoed, there's certainly no requirement to. But there does seem to be, quote unquote, an inyan to. I don't know how to translate that into English, but there's some value in it. Perhaps not halachic, but certainly. Mystically, there might be such an idea, and actually not so much in Chabad, but in other communities of Chassidim, they are careful to have a meal every day of Chol HaMoed, a proper meal, and in some places even too. I know locally Rabbi Unger, he has both on Chol HaMoed Pesach and on Chol HaMoed Sukkos, they sit down with the family and have a full sort of Yom Tov meal twice every day of Chol HaMoed, in the morning after Shachris and in the evening after Ma'ariv. So there is that idea, yes.
Specifically, or not differentiating between chumra and matzah versus...
No, that's an important topic, but it's not connected to Gebrokts.
So it's irrelevant for purposes of the...
Correct, yes. Okay, now just to give you...
Do that so they can bench?
Yeah, that's the idea, they're having a meal, yes.
Right.
Now, So just to give you a little bit map of what to expect over here, the first source that we have, the first source that sort of directly and explicitly addresses that this chumra is a new thing instituted in recent years, and explaining what the halachic reasons for this minhag is a tshuva written by the Alter Rebbe. This tshuva, any sefer that you ever look at that discusses the chumra of Gebrokts, is always going to fall back on to this tshuva. The tshuva is fascinating, and last year a friend of mine, who I've quoted before, Rabbi Hamnik, he really discovered exactly the foods that the Alter Rebbe is talking about over there. And next week in Yetz Hashem we'll play a video where you could watch, an ancient tribe that's currently living somewhere, I think in Iran or something, who still bake the foods that the Alter Rebbe is talking about over there. And we're going to see that next week. So the tshuva of the Alter Rebbe and exactly what that's all about, we're going to do next week. I should say in part 2, there is a chance that it will be in 2 weeks, and that is because there is a possibility in the pipeline of having an interesting guest speaker who will be in town next week. But we're not going to announce that until it gets confirmed. But in part 2 of this series, we're going to look at the tshuva of the Alter Rebbe, and again, it's a fascinating tshuva to really understand it properly. But what we're going to do today is interesting in its own right, and also will serve as an introduction to understanding that tshuva properly. Now, before we get to Gebrokts, we have to ask a more fundamental question, and that is, what can you use to make food on Pesach? So, in other words, what's the idea of Gebrokts or knaidlech, right? You need flour, right? Now, what would other options of, how else could you use flour on Pesach? So, the Gemara says, this is in the Gemara in Pesachim, Daf Lamed Tes Amid Beis, which all you guys who come to the Gemara class now know that means 39b. Tanu Rabbanan. Elu Dvarim She'ein Baim L'dei Chimutz. These are things that cannot become chametz. The ha'afui, a food that has already been baked, cannot become chametz. V'hamavushal, a food that has become cooked, can never become chametz. V'chalot shechaloti b'reischin, and something that's boiled, flour that's boiled and thrown directly into boiling hot water. We're not going to get into that third thing right now. How could you say that cooked food can't become chametz? If you take flour and you cook it, while you're cooking it, it's going to become chametz. And for the Gemara, well, we don't mean that you could cook flour on Pesach. Yeah? You can't make pasta on Pesach. That would clearly become chametz. Rather, we mean baked food that has been cooked. So in other words, what the Gemara is saying here is that baked food cannot become chametz. So that means matzah, once it's fully baked, now you could soak it in water, you could do whatever you want with it, it's never going to become chametz. And hamavushal, you could even cook it. Once the matzah is baked, even though before you baked the matzah while it was still raw, you couldn't have cooked it, because cooking it would make it become chametz. But now that it's already baked, you are allowed to cook it. Now, a few lines later on that Gemara, on the same page, the Gemara says, a person should not line the edge of his pot with roasted flour. Okay? Because perhaps it's not cooked properly, or it won't be baked properly, and it will become chametz. Okay? So here the Gemara is giving us a clue to another possible idea. If I want to make Pesach foods, right, why do I have to bother? So until now you think, okay, so again, Gebrokts doesn't exist yet, right? So we just have the plain Gemara. You could take matzah, bake it, and once it's baked, you can grind it into matzah meal, and then you make whatever you want out of the matzah meal, right? But l'chayra, there's a much simpler idea. Why do I have to go through the whole hassle of making matzah? Why don't I just take the shmura flour, take flour that's not chametz, roast the flour, and once it's completely roasted, you've killed off whatever chemicals and the gluten or whatever it is that can become chametz. And now use that flour to make whatever you want. Why do you have to go through the whole hassle, right? Tell your wives this idea, they'll be thrilled, right? Why do you have to go through the whole hassle of taking matzah, making it into matzah meal? Just take flour and roast it.
What's the definition of roasted flour?
Bake a flour. Put flour
versus bake.
Bake is when you've made it into matzah. That means you mixed it with water, you've made it into a dough.
Okay.
And then you take it, and then you've baked the bread, and you're taking that bread and re-grinding it back up into flour. That's a whole lot of process which seems unnecessary. Just take the flour as it is. Don't mix it with water. Don't make it into a dough. Don't make it into bread. Just take plain flour, put it in the oven. The oven will roast the flour. The flour will kill off any possibility of this flour ever becoming chametz, and then use that flour for whatever you want. Sounds like a good idea.
This would work.
Right? Says the Gemara, no, you can't do that.
Yeah.
Why not? Because there's a concern that it might not be cooked properly. It might not be baked properly. In other words, if you just roast flour, what's to tell you that the flour is properly roasted? Maybe somewhere in there's a grain of flour that didn't get properly subject to the heat of the oven and it's not properly roasted, so it still has the potential with the chemicals of becoming chametz. So because of that, we avoid it. Now I should point out... What?
There's no way to monitor the completeness of the process.
Right. Now the truth is... Yes?
I guess you could
Say,
see if
if
something's
there
baked.
is
It looks
you
like
need the
flour before it looks like
confirmation
flour
that
after.
all yeast is dead. essentially.
Right, exactly. Now, Rabbeinu Hanan... Sorry?
So do you have that traction the other way?
One second.
Monitor the baking?
No. One second, we're going to get to that. Now, Rabbeinu Hanan... One moment. Rabbeinu Hanan says on that Gemara that a person shouldn't line the pot with this roasted flour, the leiboshel shapir, that is not cooked properly, and it might become chametz. And we'll touch more on this Rabbeinu Hananel perhaps next week, but the reason why this is important is because Rabbeinu Hananel seems to be saying that the concern is that you shouldn't use roasted flour that's not roasted properly. So he doesn't seem to be understanding the Gemara that you shouldn't use roasted flour because there's a concern that it may not be roasted properly. He says, just make sure, and before you use roasted flour, make sure that it's roasted properly. This Rabbeinu Hananel is not really relevant to halacha. We don't pass like Rabbeinu Hananel. We pass that you're not allowed to use roasted flour at all, but I did mention Rabbeinu Hananel, like I said, because it's going to come up in part 2 of this series. Now, if we look at the Rambam, one second, there's another Gemara. Okay, there's another Gemara which we have to look at. No, we're going to get to the Gemara soon. The Rambam says like this. The Rambam is in Hilchos Chametz, Matzah, the laws of Chametz, chapter Perek Hey, chapter 5, Halacha Gimel and Halacha Hey. In Halacha Gimel, he says, Ein koilin es habotzik b'shemen al machras. You can't fry dough for Pesach with oil on the pan, because the concern is that before it gets properly baked, you're allowed to bake matzah on a dry pan, but you can't put oil because that would interfere with the process and it could become chametz. Avol, what are you allowed to do? Says the Rambam. Listen carefully what you are allowed to do. Mevashlan esapas, you're allowed to cook bread. In other words, you're allowed to take matzah, break it down, and cook matzah, or for the same price, break it down into matzah meal and cook it. And you're allowed to cook roasted flour. Hold on a second. We just learned the Gemara that you're not allowed to cook roasted flour. Okay, now, hold on to that. 2 halachas later, the Rambam says like this. Carmel, Carmel are whole grains. Whole grains that you roast on the flame, and then you grind it. You're not allowed to cook its flour in water, because perhaps it's not roasted properly, and it could still become chametz when you cook it. Later in that halacha, the Rambam again uses the word kamach kali, flour of kali, which means caramel also. So the way so what's going on? The Rambam in Halacha Gimel says you are allowed to cook roasted flour. Here he says you're not. So the explanation of the Rambam is actually quite simple. The Rambam differentiates between 2 types of roasted flour. You could have flour, literally flour that you roast, or alternatively, you could have grains, whole grains that you roast, and after you roast them, then you ground it into flour. Says that, so the Rambam understands this Gemara of Mazutra says that you're not allowed to line the edge of the pot with roasted flour. The Rambam understands that is referring specifically to roasted flour of grains that you roasted while the grains were whole, and then you ground them into flour. That's what you're not allowed to do. But because why not? Like the Gemara says, there's a concern that perhaps the grain didn't get roasted through and through, and somewhere inside the grain there's a tiny speck of wheat that's not fully roasted, and then when you grind it into flour, that speck of wheat is going to turn into a speck of flour that is not roasted, and that could become chametz.
But if it's flour first?
But if you take already ground flour and then you roast it, says the Rambam here, we don't have any concern that this flour is going to be not fully roasted and gesundheit. So according to the Rambam, you don't need to make knaidlech, you don't need to bother taking matzah meal. You just take flour, obviously flour that you know is not chametz. You can't nowadays. The flour you buy from the store is already chametz because it has water in the process of making it. But flour that you know is not chametz, and you roast it in the oven, and then you could do whatever you want with it. You can make cakes. You can do whatever you want, right? Says the Beis Yosef.
Scientifically, there's an easy solution to that. You can use vegetables, such as cauliflower, to make the same process.
So again, we saw that that they were using buckwheat. Of course, there are alternatives, but alternatives are alternatives, right? What if you just want to have normal food, right? It doesn't say anywhere. Even though nowadays once upon a time we associated Pesach with knaidlech. Now we associate Pesach with a kitchen that looks like a spaceship and like only having 3 different types of foods you can eat from, right? But by the way, there were some people who refrained from using potato starch on Pesach also. We'll see soon why. Even those who do eat potatoes. We'll get to that, right? But says the Rambam, you could just have roasted flour. You with us, Steve?
Yep.
Says the Beis Yosef. Beis Yosef brings this Rambam, and then he says, Avol, Rabbeinu Yerucham, Kosav, Rabbeinu Yerucham throws a wrench into the wheel. He says, No, Shum Shumasim is Kanach Matano, women who place flour in the oven, Lisyabish to dry it up, Kadelas is Tavshalatanoikus to make dishes for their children. Also, it's forbidden. Because perhaps it's not cooked properly. This is the opinion of Tosfos. Based on this Gemara of not lining your pot with roasted flour. So essentially, what the Beis Yosef has now told us is that this is indeed the opinion of the Rambam, that roasted flour is not a problem, and that the problem is only if you roasted whole grains and then ground it into flour. But Rabbeinu Yerucham and Tosfos and the Smak and the Hagos Maimonides and all these others, they say absolutely not. Even though, of course, on a biblical level, it would not be chametz, but you're not allowed to use any type of roasted flour on Pesach because there's a concern that maybe it's not properly roasted, and so your only option of making dishes with starch or whatever on Pesach is to have fully baked matzah, and then you take that matzah and grind it up, and then you could use that to cook. And let's just 1 second before we have questions. Let's just see how we paskin in Shulchan Aruch. I'm going to read for you, this is in all the Paskim, I'm going to read for you the way it's quoted in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, in Siman Tov Samech Gimel, that's chapter 463, Seif Beis, and I'll read it for you straight out of the English from the Cross translation. Just a moment. If the stalks or the kernels of wheat that were roasted in an oven or over fire were ground into flour, that flour should not be cooked in water, lest the grain not have been roasted thoroughly in the fire, and the flour become chametz in the water before it cooks there. That's the whole grains, right? Then he says, even if flour itself was roasted in an oven, it should not be cooked in water, lest it not have been roasted thoroughly. What's that? That's the opinion that Rabbi Yosef just brought now in the name of the host of Rishonim, Tosfos, and Rabbeinu Yerucham, and the Smak, etc. Then the Alter Rebbe continues, there are authorities who permit cooking roasted flour because the heat of the fire has a greater effect on flour than it does on kernels of grain. Who's that? Who's this the second opinion that Alter Rebbe is quoting? Rambam, right? The Rambam says that that the problem is only if you roasted whole grains. That's when we have a concern that inside there might be a speck that's not properly roasted. But flour, if it's already flour, then the direct heat of the oven directly impacts all the flour, there's no problem. How do we paskin? Says the Alter Rebbe, one may rely on their words after the fact, i.e., if one violated the above directed and you made a cooked dish using such flour, he may be permitted to derive benefit from it or maintain its possession of it until after Pesach. So, b'di'evet, we paskin like the Rambam, meaning, if you went ahead and you did it, you took roasted flour and make the dish, we're not going to allow you to eat it, but we don't treat it as chametz, you don't need to sell it, and you could even derive benefit from it. But l'chatchila, you're not allowed to do that. L'chatchila, we paskin like all those other opinions which the Beis Yosef quoted, that there's that the concern of mazutra that perhaps it's not going to be properly roasted applies both to roasted grains and to roasted flour. Yes.
Okay, so maybe the last point answers my question, but I'll ask it anyway. It doesn't seem like there's much of malachas about the 18 minutes baking the matzah, chumra matzah, that whole thing, right? But here, there's disagreements when it comes to the grain. I
Yes.
just find it interesting, the contrast between the flour everybody pretty much agrees on, I assume, the 18 minutes. But when it comes to the grains, then people are not.
I'm not. Clarify what you mean by the 18 minutes.
The flour to make the matzah, that gets baked for no longer than 18 minutes, right?
No, it gets baked for a few seconds. When the way we do make matzah today is that we're careful that from when the flour comes in contact with the water until it comes out of the oven should be no more than 18 minutes, which is a chumra which has a lot of basis. It's not the time to discuss that now. But strictly speaking, it could be baked even longer than that, as long as you make sure to keep the requirements of how long it takes for things to become chametz. But the point is that for whatever reason we're saying that whereas when it comes to roasted wheat and even to roasted flour, we're going to be concerned that perhaps it's not properly roasted. When it comes to matzah, to bake, once it's already into a bread, then we, as of now, we're comfortable with saying, look, this matzah is completely baked. We know that it's baked through and through. We have no concern of there being any raw dough in the middle of the matzah, and so now you can comfortably grind it up and make it into matzah meal.
So when you do the matzah factory today, how long are you going to bake the matzah?
The matzah, the factory that we use today is chametz. It's not real matzah.
But do you simulate the process?
Yeah, it's just to show the kids how it's done. It's not.
How long do you bake it for? Doesn't it?
However long it takes. Yeah, no, we tell them that in a real bakery you keep the 18 minutes. But the time, the matzah that they're going to bake today is chametz before you start. It's you're taking chametz flour from Jewel. It's not.
It's
yeah.
not gonna be,
No.
You're not grinding?
Sorry.
You're not going to grind the wheat stuff?
Maybe they will, but so that's all part of the. Okay. Now, so story so far, we decided to consider maybe we can avoid the whole matzah meal thing and just use roasted flour, and it turns out that that is not an option. Okay, so our only option is to if we want to make some sort of dish with the dough or with grains, your only option is to use ground matzah. Now, then there becomes a chumra of Gebrokts. So what is the reason for this chumra? Like I said, in part 2 of this series, we're going to see what the Alter Rebbe explains. What we're going to do now for the rest of the class today is touch upon other suggestions that have been made over the years. So, the Gemara says, and I apologize, I see the time is 9:50, we're probably going to go a little bit over time today. The Gemara says, in Pesachim daf mem amid beis, Rav Papi shari leburdiki lebeirish gelusa lamimcha ketere bechasisi. Rav Papi allowed the cooks of the house, the chefs of the household of the exilok, to mash roasted grains into a pot. Rava says, are you allowed to do this in a place where servants are found? Servants are unlikely to be careful with regard to these prohibitions, and so basically you do something, if you do something in the presence of these servants, so they might not understand what you're doing, so even though you're doing something permitted, they might mistranslate it, and they may misunderstand it, and end up doing something that's forbidden. Some say no, Rava himself would do this. So the bottom line is that even though there is some concern mentioned here that you're not allowed to do this in the presence of unlearned people, of avadim or whatever it is, unscrupulous people, the bottom line is it's permissible. Now, what is this thing that we're allowed to do? What is this mimchi? So there are 3 opinions as to what this is about. There's the opinion of Rashi, which says that it's the same thing we were talking about before, the roasted flour. There's the opinion of Tosfos that says that we're talking here about flour made out of lentils, so then this touches onto the whole kitnius thing, but it's not related at all to us. And then you have the opinion of the Rambam, which understands that what was going on over here was that they were using baked matzah. They were using matzah meal, right? So, yeah, that's how the Rambam explains this Gemara. How do we paskin from this Gemara? So I'm going to open up again, it's on all the paskin, but I'm just going to read it to you from the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. Matzah fuya, baked matzah, shechazar otuchana that you then reground it into matzah meal, you're allowed to cook that flour, that matzah meal, and to make whatever you want out of it. I feel even in places where there might be the servants present, who are not careful about the prohibitions of the Torah. We do not concern ourselves that maybe when they see you making a dish out of matzah meal, we're not concerned that people will then extend that allowance to make a dish out of roasted wheat, roasted flour. It's okay, right? So basically, the bottom line is this Gemara says that you are allowed to use Gebrokts. However, from the fact that we're toying with this idea of maybe don't do it in front of people who will mistake it, of these avodim, that could be seen perhaps as not a reason, but not a basis, but at least some sort of idea. Oh, why might somebody have come up with the chumra of Gebrokts? Maybe the chumra of Gebrokts is based on this idea. The Gemara says don't do it in front of people who will who will extend the allowance more than it was intended to. So this suggestion is made by Rabbi Shlomo Kluger. Rabbi Shlomo Kluger, his dates are 1785 to 1869. He was known as the Maggid of Brody. He was the Rav in the city of Brody, Poland, Galicia, and he is a monumental in terms of his importance as a Pesach in that generation, one of the biggest poskim of his time. Prolific posik. He wrote over 150 svarim, perhaps even a world record on some level, and he points to this Gemara as perhaps being a source for the idea for the chumra of Gebrokts.
So for him, it's not like I'm really worried that because water is going to come in contact with the flour, something's going to happen. I'm really worried that somebody who sees that I'm like lackadaisical about this, they might think, oh, you could do this with flour too.
Exactly. So first of all, so there's two things. There's two things important to point out based on this. If we're going to point to this Gemara as being the source for the Gebrokts, there's two important points to point out. First of all, the reason for the chumra is somebody might take the wrong message away. Somebody's going to see you using matzah meal and think that it's okay to use roasted flour. Okay, that's A. B, the concern would only be matzah meal. There wouldn't be any concern about dipping your matzah into soup. It's only once you've ground it into matzah meal that now it has a resemblance to flour, and somebody might say, oh, well then you could take roasted flour and do whatever you want. But according to this source, there would be no basis whatsoever to be machmir not to dip matzah into your soup. Yes?
It was
Yes? Yes, everybody with me here?
It would seem that ignores the notion of not putting a cart before a blind man.
Yeah, but again, even so, it's only with regards to making matzah meal, not with regards to making your matzah wet, because wet matzah cannot by any stretch be confused with roasted flour. Yes, Steve?
I got it.
Yeah, it would only be when I'm taking a matzah flour or ground up matzah and then cooking with it and doing. It would only be that. It would not be. Oh, can I dip my matzah?
Exactly.
It would only be cooking with it.
Exactly, 100%. Now here, yes.
So is. Let's say I'm doing this in my home. Nobody's around. Okay, so nobody can.
Okay, so again, we're not saying that this is a basis that you have to be machmir because of this. Often a chumra can be born out of a very far-fetched concern or some basis, and that sort of it sort of develops a life of its own, and then it becomes this becomes the minhag, right? So we're not saying, and the fact is that we don't even paskin like this sort of. This says clearly in Shulchan Aruch that we're not concerned about that. But if Shlomo Kluger is suggesting perhaps this served as the sort of the embryo from where the chumra of Gebrokts was born out of. Now I'm going to show you something quite funny actually. So, and this goes back a lot earlier than Reb Shlomo Kluger. So there is the Ra'avon and the Ra'avyo. The Ra'avon is a very important Ashkenazi Pesach, and he is the grandfather of Rav Yah. Now, I didn't copy for myself. Everything okay? I didn't copy for myself the dates of the Ra'avon, but the Rav Yah's dates are approximately 1140 to 1220, and he was born in Mainz in Germany, and he passed away in Cologne in Germany in the year 1220. And his he's a student. And he's a student of his grandfather, the Ra'avon. Now, in some contemporary authors. I'm reading this out of an article from Rabbi Gedalia Oberlander, but perhaps it's already been suggested by Mendel Kasher and others that if you look at the writings of the Ravon and the Rav Yah, you will find a source for the chumra of Gebrokts. Now, Mendel, it's a bit disturbing this. So, let me read to you what the Ravon and the Rav Yah say and how people have understood this to be a source for Gebrokts, and then you'll see actually something quite funny. So, the Ravon says like this. There are those people who do not want to soak the matzah the first night into the soup. Mihu einotiv lasis farfel shaloi yasu gam mikemach v'toivu leser zeh mipneza. The Ravon says that there are people who refrain from dipping the matzah in the soup on the first night, and they think the reason they're refraining from this is because there's a concern of the matzah becoming chametz when you dip it in the soup, but that's absolutely incorrect. There's no concern. The reason why people don't dip matzah in the soup on the first night of Pesach is because the first night is when there's a mitzvah to eat matzah, so they want to have only the pure taste of matzah in their mouth, not any modified taste of matzah. Then he finishes off. However, you shouldn't make farfel, which, exactly the farfel we have today, something farfel, I'm not sure if the farfel he's referring to is exactly the same thing that we have, but it's some dish made out of matzah meal. And he says, you shouldn't do that. Why not? So that you shouldn't also make it from flour, and this is a good reason, okay? So this idea that we saw from Rabbi Shlomo Kluger seems to be paralleled here in the words of the Ravon, where he's saying that it's a good idea to refrain from making farfel because people could confuse it with flour. Then comes along the Rav Yah, and I'm going to read you the Rav Yah the way it's written here in this article. It sounds like this. Baked matzah that you cooked, for example, for an old person who needs it to be able to eat, there's no concern of chametz. However, some people, listen carefully to his words, this is really important. Says the Rav Yah, the Aviazri, some are strict not to cook matzah, this matzah meal, so that people shouldn't come to make a mistake. The chumra shel balhu, and is a chumra of a bal. What's bal? Says the publisher of the Rav Yah, there's a word missing here. The word bal doesn't make any sense. It must be that it was meant to say v'chumra shel bal nefeshu. Bal nefesh means a meticulous person. Says the Rav Yah, it's a chumra of a meticulous person to refrain from cooking the matzah. Now, so, okay. Okay, 1 second. Hold your horses. Okay. So the Rav Yah has said. So the Ravon. Let's focus on the grandson, on the Rav Yah. The Rav Yah said two things. Number one, there's a chumra not to cook the matzah because people would come to make a mistake. And he says that it is a chumra of. Let's for now read it as a chumra of a meticulous person. What is the mistake that the Rav Yah is concerned here with? So Rabbi Oberlander and others say, very simple. It's exactly what we're talking about here. The mistake might be that people would make is that just like you're allowed to cook matzah meal, you're allowed to cook roasted flour. Okay? So therefore, people point to this Rav Yah as perhaps a very early source for the chumra of Gebrokts. Steve is unimpressed, it seems.
No, I'm just wondering if the same situation they would say, well, you can't make a Passover cake out of potato flour.
Oh, very good. And there were people who had such a chumra. There are people till today who, even though we eat potatoes on Pesach, they won't make any dishes out of potato flour or potato starch because it has that. There is such a chumra.
For that reason, because they could think it was
right.
Okay.
Yeah. Now,
The Aruch HaShulchan, I believe, was against.
Yeah. So then you come into a whole discussion of whether or not is this. No, some people had other concerns with potatoes. They didn't know exactly what it was. It was a new food, and there's also kidneys. There's all sorts of the history of potatoes.
He was probably for him. It was kidneys, I think.
Could be. The history of potatoes on Pesach is a fascinating topic. Not for now. Akiva's touching on, is this what Judaism is about? To just keep on coming up with your own new chumras, which is certainly a lot of the discussion about all of this. Yes. It touches upon this. We're going to see next week the Pri Chadash in part 2, where we learn the Tshuva of the Alter Rebbe. The Tshuva of the Alter Rebbe is based in part on the Tshuva, on the writing on the Pri Chadash, and the Pri Chadash is very against it for this reason. He says, well, what's this idea of making up new gzeros? Others disagreed. Again, maybe we'll touch on that more next week. However, here's where I really want to get to. There is a critical edition of the Raviyah published in Bnei Brak in Tafshin Samachay, that's 2005, by Hagoyin, Reb David, by Hagoyin Reb Sharia Dublinsky. So Reb Sharia Dublinsky is a famous Pesach. This is his son. He publishes this critical edition. Now, if you open up the Mavoi, the preface to this edition, he writes like this: there are three complete manuscripts that have survived. In other words, three complete manuscripts of Raviyah that have survived. The first one is called Ksav Yad London, Manuscript London, number 11. Then you have Ksav Yad Oxford, number 66, and then you have Ksav Yad Montefiore, number 115, right? So that's how manuscripts works. They're cataloged in libraries, they all get a number. So these are the three manuscripts that he's working off to get his accurate edition of this Sefer. And he goes through, in his introduction, in his preface, describing exactly the condition of each of these three manuscripts, and describing how he determines which of the three is the most accurate, and when there's a difference between them, how to determine which of the three is the most accurate edition. So I'm not going to read the whole preface, but he goes through, like any good critical edition of any work would do. He's done his homework. Now, turn to Pesachim, chapter 475, which is the Raviyah where we're talking about, and he says like this. Tanya, the Gemara says, you fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah with matzah that is soaked in water, and even with matzah that is cooked, as long as it's not nimayach, as long as it's not dissolved. Rabbi Yossi, no. Yoitzin, Rabbi Yossi, those who come to our Gemara class know Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says no. Yoitzin b'rakik hashari, you're allowed to use matzah for the mitzvah that is soaked. Avaloi b'mavushal, you're not allowed to use cooked matzah. Okay? This is also how we paskin. I was hoping to read the Alter Rebbe inside, but there's no time. But if you look in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch in Siman Tav Samech Aleph, chapter 461, see if you'd Beis, Yud Gimel, and Yud Daled, that's enumerated very clearly, that to fulfill your mitzvah of eating matzah on the first night of Pesach, you may not cook the matzah, but you could dip it in water to soften it. So that's how we paskin. Practically speaking, if any of you have a guest at your Seder table who doesn't have teeth and can't eat the matzah, what do? You violate Gebrokts. Yes, you violate the Gebrokts because there's an obligation to eat matzah. You take the matzah, you get it wet, you soften it with a little bit of water, and then the person could eat it. But you cannot eat cooked matzah. And then he finishes off, some are careful not to soak the matzah so that you shouldn't come to make a mistake. And then his last words are, "V'chumra shall hevelhu." This is a foolish chumra, right? Now, that word that we originally said, chumra shall bal nefesh, it's a chumra of a pious, a meticulous person. He says, chumra shall hevelhu. Says Rabbi Dublinsky in his footnotes that in Ksav Yad London, that's how it says. In Ksav Yad London, it says chumra shall hevelhu. It's a foolish chumra. However, the other manuscripts, the manuscript from Montefiore and the manuscript from, I think the other one was Oxford, right? Yeah. There it says chumra shel balhu. It's a chumra of a bal, but that doesn't mean anything. So the earlier publisher of the work added in the word nefesh to make it mean it's a chumra of a meticulous person. But actually the word nefesh was never there. The word that was there was bal, and the word bal was a typo, or whatever a typo was when you had handwritten hando. Yeah, it was a mistake. And instead of the word hevel, which is hey base lamed, the person wrote base ayin lamed, so two letters were right, and somehow the hey switched for an ayin, and you have obviously in ancient handwriting, it's easy for such mistakes to appear. So first of all, the Raviyah is by no means condoning this chumra. He's saying this is a foolish chumra. But more importantly, what is the chumra that the Raviyah is calling foolish, or even if you want to say he's condoning it, he's saying that you shouldn't come to make a mistake. Well, when Rabbi Oberlander brought this Raviyah, what he seemed to be saying was that what's the mistake you might be making? That you might think that just like you're allowed to use matzah meal, you're allowed to use roasted flour. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about eating matzah on the first night of Pesach. And he's saying, some have a chumra not to soak the matzah in water, because somebody would come to make a mistake and think that what? That you're allowed to cook the matzah. Those are the two things he's talking about. He's saying cooking the matzah, no. Soaking the matzah in water, yes. You want to soften the matzah for the Seder night. You have an obligation to eat matzah. So you have two options. One option is to cook it. That option is out. We say that you do not fulfill your obligation with cooked matzah. Your other option is to soak it. Some people were refrained from soaking it in water because they were scared people would mistake that just like you're allowed to soak it in water, soften it with water, you're allowed to cook it. and therefore they would refrain from making the matzah wet. Says the Rabbi, that's a foolish chumra, because the guy's not going to fulfill the mitzvah of matzah, because you're being chumra, you're not letting, he can't eat the matzah. Again, in the times of the Rabbi, I didn't look it up exactly, but probably in his days they were having very hard, thick matzah that was difficult to eat without water, even for a person who did have teeth.
Why not wet it with wine?
What?
Why not wet it with wine?
Because the Rabbi, 100%. Well, no, you can't add wine because that would add flavor. You know, it has to be bread of the.
But some liquid other than...
It doesn't matter as far as the Rav Yah is concerned. It would still be confused. No, you couldn't add any other liquid for the Seder night. But it's irrelevant because the Rav Yah is not talking here about Gebrokts. He has no problem with you soaking more matzah in water the rest of Pesach. He's just saying don't do it on the Seder night because somebody will think that just like you're allowed to use wet matzah, you're allowed to use cooked matzah, and even that he says is a foolish minhag, is a foolish chumra. Now, so the Rav Yah, just a moment. So even though some people, without seeing the proper version of the Rav Yah, equated the Rav Yah with the Ravon, the Rav Yah is certainly irrelevant, totally irrelevant to the chumra of Gebrokts. The Ravon may actually be, like we saw before from Shlomo Kluger, that might be a source for this minhag that people might confuse roasted matzah meal with roasted flour. However, even the Ravon is also not so 100% clear, as he points out Rabbi Dublinsky points out in the footnotes over here that that it's possible that the Ravon also is only talking about on the first night of Pesach.
And it's only matzah meal.
And again, and even if the Ravon is talking about the whole Pesach, like we pointed out before, the issue with Reb Shlomo Kluger is again that it is only with regards to matzah meal and not with regards to wet matzah. So the bottom line is, as of right now, we have yet to see any good source or reason for the chumra of Gebrokts, and now I'm going to have to leave you in suspense until part 2 of this series, which will either be next week or the following week, depending on if the guest speaker works out, and where we're going to see in depth the tshuva of the Alter Rebbe, where the Alter Rebbe sheds a whole new light onto the whole halachic basis for the chumra of Gebrokts, and specifically why we should keep this chumra even though it's such a far-fetched chumra. So all of that we're going to discuss in part 2, which again will the Mietz Hashem have, maybe Reb Natan realize will help us set up a nice video screen, and it's going to be all hands-on and a fascinating class, so looking forward to that.
Thank you, Rabbi.